Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to USU 1300. We have Harley here again. Aiden apparently has bailed on us, so I don't know if he forgot. He probably just forgot. But it's just going to be Harley and I today. So we're going to talk a little bit about proportional representation. But before we do that, we want to address a couple of questions that popped up from students over the last couple of days around the whole primary process. The first one that Harley had mentioned was some of you were asking about what does this horse race typically look like, as far as do we have one candidate that usually pulls far ahead pretty quickly, or is it more competitive where during the primary members of the political party, either the Republicans or the Democrats, seem to have many candidates that are kind of close to each other? And the honest answer to that question is it totally depends on the primary season. So the current primary season was really close. Everybody was polling fairly close to each other with the exception of Joe Biden when the primary process first started, like 8 months ago when people started announcing candidacies. When we came to the actual voting season, things had tightened up a little bit, so we saw basically four frontrunners. You had Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, good grief, Bernie Sanders, and then Pete Buttigieg. And then after Iowa and the New Hampshire caucuses, people were thinking, well, Buttigieg has got kind of this momentum going. Sanders seems doing really well. Biden's kind of fallen off. And then again, we talked a little bit about this last week, but Super Tuesday rolled around and all of the moderates dropped out, and then it was just Biden and Sanders. So that's what happened in 2020 for the Dems. For the Republicans back in 2016, again, they had a pretty divided primary field. So you had Trump and Cruz and Kasich and a few others. And there just wasn't enough consensus around anybody that Trump kept winning plurality after plurality, and then he became basically the nominee by default because nobody could catch up with him. So hopefully that helps answer that. The other question that popped up was, why do we have closed primaries? So one of the things that we mentioned on Tuesday is that some political parties will say, hey, you can't participate in our primary unless you're actually a registered member of our political party. Utah Republicans, for example, don't allow you to participate in the primary if you're not a Republican. Utah Democrats don't care. They let basically anybody in to go ahead and participate. And the reasons for that vary, but the biggest one typically is around control. So the party wants to make sure it's controlling who actively participates, largely as a way to ensure that they get the kind of candidate they're looking for. Because theoretically, if the Republicans had an open primary and Democrats could participate, then maybe Democrat voters would come in and start voting for somebody that wouldn't be the ideal Republican candidate, if that makes sense.
That does make sense.
So that's why we typically see closed primaries. And whether or not a primary is open or closed depends on the state political party. So Utah Republicans might be closed, but Republicans in a different state might have an open primary process. It's not a national rule. So hopefully that helps answer some of your guys' questions. All right, so proportional representation. Harley, before we start, anything specific that you think we should talk about?
No, just as long as we go over the electoral college and all that. I don't know about you guys, I always get confused with this, so
Okay.
yeah, just simple.
We'll talk about the electoral college, and I will try and explain it so that I
Okay.
can understand it, and we'll see what happens. All right, so in the United States, we have winner takes all, first past the post voting processes, and we've talked about this for the past couple of lectures. The United States is relatively unique in that when we talk about democracies, most democracies don't have a winner-take-all system.
Mhm.
They actually have a parliamentary system that is some form of proportional representation. The big difference between proportional representation and winner-take-all systems is how we go ahead and assign power based off of votes. In a winner-take-all system, whoever has the most votes wins 100% of the power. In a proportional system, power is awarded based off of my percentage of votes. And that's the big fundamental difference. The U.S. has another wrinkle, and for this conversation, we're initially going to start at the presidential level, and then we'll talk about what proportional representation might look like if we had it at the congressional level. So that would be the House and the Senate. Now this is all assuming that you guys have watched those two videos that we posted in the channel description or in the message that we sent out earlier, which gave you an overview of two different types of proportional systems. One is MMR, mixed member, and then the other one is just a generic kind of power sharing proportional system. So in the United States, we're going to start with the Electoral College. This is a presidential election. So we discussed this last time, but we don't have a direct vote for president. So it's not whoever wins the most votes by the people wins the presidency. It's whoever wins the most electoral colleges. And every state is assigned a certain amount of electoral colleges. Harley, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you remember how that number is chosen?
Population. Brother, how many senators? How many people in the House?
Okay, so those last two, right? So electoral college votes are determined by my Senate count. So how many senators do I have? And my House of Representative count. So in Utah, we have 2 senators because every state gets 2 senators. That's just the flat number that was agreed upon when the Constitution was put together. House of Representatives is based off of population, and we have any idea how many representatives we have in Congress? I'm curious. I mean, we've mentioned it a couple of times.
We have 4.
We have, well, Utah has 4. Good. Do you know how many total there are?
There's like hundreds.
Don't you hate it when there are hundreds? There's 435. Okay, and that number has stayed pretty consistent over time. And so these 4 come because our percentage of the national population is worth 4 representatives. And so every 10 years we have a census. It's going on right now, as a matter of fact. And the census is super important because it determines how many representative states get. Because when we count the population, if our percentage of population goes up in comparison to other states, then we might get another representative. If our percentage of population goes down in comparison to other states, we might lose a representative. So we don't add representatives to the House of Representatives as the United States grows in population. We just award those representatives differently based off of state percentages. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So we have 2 senators and we have 4 members in the House, giving us a total of 6 electoral college votes. Now again, in the current winner-take-all, first-past-the-post kind of process, whoever wins the most votes in Utah during a presidential election, because that's what we're focusing on right now, wins all 6 or 100% of these electoral college votes. So, and every state has at least 2 plus 1, because every state has 2 senators and then at least 1 representative in the House. And so we look at all of the states and we say, okay, so you get X amount of electoral college votes, you get X amount of electoral college votes, and in order for the person to win the presidency, they have to win 50% of the electoral college votes plus 1. So a majority of the electoral college votes, which is 271. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's 271. And so the Electoral College is basically an additional buffer between Americans and how we actually choose who our president is. And again, these votes are in almost every state in the United States awarded based off of a winner-take-all system. So we talked about this on Tuesday, where in Utah, Donald Trump had actually about 45% of the vote in Utah, but he actually won all 6 Electoral College votes because it was the most votes for any single candidate. So we're good so far?
Yes.
Okay. This is the U.S. system. Now, in proportional representation, we can look at proportional representation at the presidential level as well. There are 2 different options, right? So there's option A, which is what we're currently doing, which is 100% of the votes of the Electoral College votes. We're going to label these as ECVs. Go to person or candidate with the most votes. Okay, so again, this is what we're currently running at. So Utah has 6 electoral college votes. Whatever candidate in the 2020 presidential election wins the most votes in the state gets 100% of our electoral college votes. Okay. Option B is if we decided to award those electoral college votes proportionally. Okay, so what we would say in B is that we have a Republican, we have a Democratic, and we have an independent candidate. And we're going to use the 2016 election as kind of our benchmark for this. So our Republican candidate wins 45% of the total state vote. Our Democratic candidate wins, we'll say, 30% of our state vote. And our independent candidate wins 25% of our state vote. Okay, so we have 6 electoral college votes for the state. This is what the electorate looked like in 2016, and the Republicans, with 45% of the votes, won 100% of the Electoral College votes, winner-take-all system. In a proportional system, you would award these 6 Electoral College votes as proportionally as possible among people that clear what we call a threshold. So typically we say the threshold is going to be 10% or 20%. It depends on how many Electoral College votes might be available. We'll say the independent, it's 20%. So everybody in here is guaranteed at least 1 vote, right? Mm-hmm. So the Republicans start with 1, the Democrats start with 1, and the independents start with 1. So that is 3 of our 6 available Electoral College votes. We're now going to assign votes until the amount of votes per party is as proportional as possible. We don't divide these up, so it's not half of an Electoral College vote. So we would say the Republicans are going to walk away with 3, and then the Democrats are going to walk away with 2. Because 3 would be about 50% of our available Electoral College votes, so they're a little overrepresented. But 50% is still not 100%. Mm-hmm. The Democrats didn't win, but they had 30% of the electorate go ahead and support them, so they get about 33% of the available Electoral College votes. And then the independent candidate had about 25% of the population support them, and so they end up with 1 Electoral College vote. So this would be a proportional assignment of Electoral College votes among the Electoral College at the state level. So again, we're taking the votes for the Electoral College and we're assigning them not 100% to whoever gets the most votes, but we're assigning them proportionally among candidates that reach a certain threshold.
Okay. Would it be the same outcome though?
That's a really good question.
I mean, if over here the Republicans, if they got 100% of the votes, all the Electoral College votes for that state, but even if they have the majority for the state, that's still, I feel like that would be the same result.
That's a really good question. So would the outcome change? Maybe yes, maybe no. It's hard to say yes it would or no it wouldn't, because we've never really done this nationally. Mm-hmm. And we talked about how this 100% assignment of Electoral College votes represses voter turnout. Because again, if I live in a completely Republican state and I'm a Democrat, why vote? If I live in a Democrat state and I'm a Republican, why vote, right? Because I feel like my vote doesn't actually do anything. And so we don't actually know if we proportionally assign those Electoral College votes, if it would increase voter turnout and in turn change the makeup of presidential elections. Now, looking past historically and saying, well, what if we did this historically? It might have altered a couple of things here and there. And the reason for that is we have some big states that are actually not solely Republican or Democrat, even though we think about them that way.
Oh.
And so 2 examples of that would actually be California and Texas. So California, for most people, it's a Democratic state, right? This is solidly a Democratic state. We think of liberal places like San Francisco, Hollywood. Texas, solidly Republican state, right? Like this is born and bred. The funny thing about this, though, is that when you look at voter populations, California has a significant population that identifies as Republican, especially in Northern California, up in the Sacramento area. And so they have a ton of conservative voters that are actually not super thrilled that their state is democratically leaning in its state elections and its national policy preferences. And they actually talk about dividing California into 3 different states or things like that. Yeah, it's awesome. So California, we think of as a Democratic state, but it actually has a really significant population that identifies conservative. Texas has a really significant population that identifies as liberal, because liberals or Democrats tend to center in big cities or urban environments. Yeah. Texas has some of the biggest cities in the country. Mm-hmm. So when you think of places like Austin or Dallas or San Antonio, those are large urban centers that have a lot of liberal voters that live in them. And so the overall Texas population might be conservative when you take in the entire state, but there's still a significant population there that identifies as Democrats or is more liberal than what state politics do. And so if you had a proportional representation or proportional allotment of the Electoral College votes from California and Texas, which are 2 of our biggest states, you would potentially see a shifting of elections, because in California now it matters that every Republican votes, because it means that their Republican nominee is going to get at least some of the huge amount of electoral college votes that come out of California. And in Texas, it now matters that liberals vote, because now the Democratic candidate is going to get some of these huge amount of electoral college votes that come out of Texas. And so could it change the face of elections? Yeah, it definitely could. And this actually invites a whole nother potential problem in the way presidential elections work. And that is because our Constitution is awesome. So a little bit of Constitution trivia. I don't know if I need this up right now. Because we have an electoral college and we don't have direct voting for the president, meaning I don't vote for Donald Trump or I don't vote for Joe Biden, which the likely candidate in 2020. Directly, I vote for somebody and then electors go and actually make their votes. The Constitution is written in such a way that if nobody clears the threshold for needed electoral college votes, then the House of Representatives decides who is going to be the next president of the United States.
Okay, say that again.
So let's say I've got 3 candidates. I guess I do need the board. We're going to draw this out. Okay, so I've got a Republican candidate, I've got a Democratic candidate, and I've got an independent candidate. Okay, and we need 271 electoral college votes in order to go ahead and win this thing, which means we have 540 total electoral college votes. I think that's right. And let's say that our Republican candidate gets 260. And our Democratic candidate gets 260, which leaves me with 20? Sure.
Okay.
Because of proportional representation, right? Because independents never win in a 2-party winner-take-all system. Evan McMullin got 0 electoral college votes in Utah, even though it's the best turnout an independent candidate has had in the state in forever. Okay, so he walked away with 0 electoral college votes, even though he gathered 20 to 30% of the voting population.
Wow.
And in a proportional system, though, McMullin would have picked up 1 or 2, right? And let's say he picks up 1 or 2 in a variety of states, and so he ends up with 20 electoral college votes. Our Democrat has 260, and our Republican has 260. Nobody made it past the threshold of our 270 plus 1. The Constitution says that the House of Representatives will then select the next president from people that garnered electoral college votes. Which means if the House is controlled by a Republican, who's going to pick it's going to be a Republican president. If the House is controlled by a Democrat, who's going to be the next president? It's going to be a Democrat, right? Or, and this was the chaos theory that came out of 2016, Evan McMullin gains electoral college votes, nobody clears the 270 threshold, and you have an individual that represents like 2% of the overall U.S. population that becomes president of the United States because the Democrats and the Republicans in the House of Representatives can't get enough votes for their particular candidate. Right? This is chaos theory.
Wow.
And so that is one potential challenge that comes with assigning electoral college votes proportionally. Is this is an unfair system. We've already talked about the fact that winner take all is inherently unfair, but it's also more stable and predictable. Somebody is going to win at least 271 electoral college votes in the current process because there's no way an independent is ever going to win state electoral college votes. Because even if the independent takes 30 or 40% of the population, if it's not the most votes in that state, they awarded 0 electoral college votes. So it encourages stability between these 2 major political parties. So yep, that is chaos theory. That might happen if we decide to go ahead and make the system more fair, which is great, right? Let's have a more fair system that makes things more chaotic. All right, so that's electoral college and proportional representation. Now, to be honest, most countries don't have an electoral college. By I mean most, I mean nobody else does. It's a weirdly, uniquely American thing. And so when we talk about proportional representation, then we typically talk about proportional representation in the legislative body, which for us would be Congress. We're going to pause there real quick, though, and we're going to answer a couple of questions that have popped up. So why do we have the Electoral College instead of a direct vote from the people? That's a great question. The reason that we have the Electoral College is because the people who wrote the Constitution didn't trust American citizens.
Wow.
Like that's the long and the short of it. They were really concerned that a populist would be able to go ahead and get elected and turn themselves into a tyrant. And so the Electoral College was designed as an aristocratic stopgap between people directly voting for the president, as a way to ensure that we pick somebody that was actually going to be a good president. Initially, Electoral College votes, I mean, it was just the Electoral College that got together, and they went ahead and they selected George Washington, and then they selected John Adams after him. And then after Adams and the election of Thomas Jefferson, you see a transition towards more popular voting impacting Electoral College decisions, for sure. But yeah, the reason that we have one is because the framers of the Constitution did not trust Americans to make that decision for themselves. That's why we don't directly vote for the president.
So it's almost like not electing a tyrant, like you said, that someone just super charismatic would, okay.
Yeah, the second thing that goes into that, though, was also a protection for small states. And this makes more sense from a math standpoint. So Wyoming has 3 Electoral College votes, right? It has 2 senators and 1 representative. When you look at the population of the state of Wyoming, their proportion of people to Electoral College votes is smaller than the state of California, which has more Electoral College votes, but also has a ton more people. And so in Wyoming, it might be a 1 to 70,000 ratio. In California, it might be a 1 to 130,000 ratio. And so the Electoral College, because every state is guaranteed 2 senators, gives more power to smaller states in selecting the next president, just because of math. So that's the other major reason. Okay, do territories and districts get representatives as well, or is there another way we do that? This is a great question. So the District of Columbia, or Washington, D.C., is actually perpetually angry at the fact that they are taxed without representation, because they don't have any formal representation from a voting standpoint in the House of Representatives or in the Senate, because they're not a state. Yep, and so yeah, it's one of those interesting quirks of American politics. Do you think the Electoral College is outdated? I'm going to kick this one to Harley, because I've been talking a lot.
So, I don't think the Electoral College is outdated, just because if we didn't have the Electoral College, there would be like 3 cities that would elect the president, and the rest of the country wouldn't have a say. And so I think that the Electoral College is very important, especially because I live in a very rural area that doesn't have
Providence
a ton,
is like a bastion of urban prosperity.
a ton of representation, and it's important to me that, especially where we are in the western United States, in Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Utah, Arizona, that we also get a say in who's elected. And so I don't personally think the Electoral College is outdated.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this one can go both ways, right? So you have a system that is stable but unfair. Do you break that for a system that becomes more proportionally fair, but only at the national perspective? Because it means that the votes of California, New York, and Texas and Florida become even more heavily weighted, because that's where the big population centers are, if you get rid of the Electoral College. Somebody asked, is if we awarded the Electoral College votes proportionally, would it affect how and where candidates campaign, and is that a good thing? So one, yeah, it's going to affect how candidates campaign, right? Yeah. Because it means that instead of just focusing on a couple of key states, so those purple states or swing states, candidates would have the incentive to go to every state, because any vote that they can garner for their particular campaign could potentially translate into Electoral College votes. That would mean that places like Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin are less important at the national level, because sure, it's a 50-50% population split, so I split the Electoral College votes with somebody else. There's no way I'm going to be able to swing that. But if I go ahead and massively increase turnout in like a Texas or a California, for example, for my particular political party, that might have a huge option for me. Or even in Utah, I mean, it makes it makes a Democrat campaigning in Utah valuable, or it makes a Republican campaigning in Massachusetts valuable, because if they can get enough of their voters to turn out, they're going to steal at least one or two of those electoral college votes. So yeah, I absolutely think it would change it. Now, is that a good thing? That's a subjective question that I honestly can't answer.
Yeah.
Like, it's good in that maybe campaigns would spend more time in more places, but again, you're talking about a system that might be less stable as a result of that.
And it almost might, like, this is my thought, I feel like it would make people more moderate that are running for president, because you couldn't take any of the states for granted. Like, oh, well, that's a Republican state, so they're going to vote for me. I mean, you would need to go in and very much relate to Democrats and, try to do everything you could to implement their policies and their ideas too, and show you understand that. So, like...
Is that good then?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Either way, I think it would make people more moderate.
This is a political science class. We refuse to take a position. No, so I mean, it would definitely be significantly different, and it would bring some problems with it for sure. The question is whether we think those challenges would outweigh the inequality that exists in the current system, and that's a really good question. All right, so that is presidential elections, but like I said, most people look at proportional representation at the legislative level. Most other countries are parliamentary systems. Which basically means they don't elect a president in the way that we do. They have a prime minister that is selected out of the parliament by the party that controls parliament. And so it's a completely different structure. That's not the focus of today's lecture. I just kind of want to talk about what proportional representation might look like if we applied it at the legislative level. So here we have three different options. So we have option A, we have option B, and we have option C. And again, these aren't the only ones. I mean, there's certainly more stuff that we could talk about here, but this is just what we want to focus on because we have limited time constraints. So we are going to focus on the state of Utah in all three examples because I think this will be the simplest example that we could go ahead and use. So in our current system, this is A, we have what we call districts. So we have 4 representatives in Utah. So we have 4, there's 1 district, 2 districts, 3 districts, and 4 districts. So we have 4 different districts in the state of Utah. Oh, sorry, people can't see that very well. And in each of those districts is represented in the House by 1 person. Okay, so we have 4 people that go to the House of Representatives, and then we have 2 senators that represent the entire state. So this is where our 6 electoral college votes come from, 2 senators, 4 representatives in the House, and each representative in the House has a specific geographic territory that they're responsible for taking care of. Now, if we look at, again, our 2016 voter turnout results, because that's the presidential election, they typically have the biggest turnout. When we look at the percentage of the population, man, that is backwards. I'm sorry, guys. That voted for a particular candidate. 20%? 20%, sure. Okay, so this is what the state population looks like. Sorry, my handwriting's terrible. 45% of the state says I'm a Republican, 35% says I'm a Democrat, and 20% says these other 2 parties are nuts, I'm an independent. When we look at our senators and our representatives, we have 2 Republican senators. Why?
Because winner takes all. There are more Republicans.
Yep. So the Senate elections are offset from each other, and in every Senate election there's more Republican voters than there are other voters as far as by individual party. So they get the most votes, which means we have 2 Republican senators. When you look at our representatives, Utah typically has 4 Republicans. Now right now, we have 1 Democrat, right? And so if we look at the state breakout, we have 5 Republicans, we have 1 Democrat, and we have 0 independents. That's our current winner-take-all system. This is not proportional, and it's not a fair allotment of votes, a vote to power, meaning that 35% of the population is underrepresented, and 20% of the population is not represented at all, because it's winner take all of the power goes to the person who receives the most votes. That's the current process. Again, very stable, very predictable, and it's the kind of process that exists in almost all of the states in the United States. We'll get back to the other questions that are popping up in chat in a few minutes. We're going to walk through these first. So this is option A. Now option B is this MMR or mixed member, sorry, MMP, mixed member proportional, MMR, mixed member representational, that we talked a little, well, that hopefully you guys watched the video on. In this one, we still have our 4 districts, okay? Each one still has a representative, and we still have our 2 senators. So there's 6 people here, no big changes yet. The big change comes in the fact that we now go ahead and we double the amount of representatives that we have. So instead of 4, we're going to go to 8 total representatives, and we'll say we're going to leave the Senate out of this and 2 Senates. Okay. What we will do, we're going to work with our same voting population here to keep this consistent. Independents 120%. Okay. In order to make this more proportional, what we'll say is, again, we're just going to ignore the Senate for right now, and we're going to focus on the House of Representatives. Republicans won 4 districts, okay, because they have designed their districts in a way to make sure that there's more Republican voters in each of these 4 districts than Democratic voters. And so they start out this process with 4 representatives. They are overrepresented, right? Because they have 50% of the power, but only 45% of the vote share. So we have 4 other representatives that are now available. These representatives get assigned between everybody else until it's roughly proportional. So in this particular case, we might say that our Dems get 3 and our independents get 1.
Okay.
Depending on how the thresholds are built in. And again, thresholds are what percentage of the population is necessary for you to actually earn one of these representatives. And so our power sharing agreement in this particular situation looks a lot closer to the amount of votes that a political party actually received. So in this, Republicans got 45% of the vote, but they own 80% of the power. In this, Republicans got 45% of the vote, and they have 50% of the power. The purpose of this mixed member system is to allow geographic representation to continue to persist. So I might say, hey, I like the idea that I have a representative that just represents my geographic locality. Like Harley was talking about, this rural concern that a politician cares about my rural issues, because those are going to be different than an urban or even a suburban environment. And so I want a representative that is focused on my geographic region. But I also acknowledge that at the state level, we should probably have representation that is closer to what we see, closer to match voter participation. So if I have 35% of the state saying I belong to this political party by the way that I vote, then 35% approximately of our representatives should probably come from that political party. Is that making sense so far?
Yep.
Okay. And then option C. Option C says we'll still keep our 4, so we're not gonna increase the size, and our 2 senators. And again, we're leaving our senators out of this. We have our Republicans, our Democrats, and our independents. Our voting percentages are staying the same, 45, 35, and 20. In this one, we get rid of districts. There are no districts now in the state. There are just 4 representatives from the state of Utah. And this is our vote breakout. So in this particular situation, we would see 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat, and 1 independent. So we don't increase the size of the House of Representatives at all. We're not adding more representatives. We're just saying we're taking the state and we're getting rid of districts. So again, from a proportionality or fairness standpoint, this is closer in power sharing to what the actual vote turnout looked like. But it does get rid of geographic districts, which means that I might have 4 people that all come from Salt Lake City. So 2 Republicans from Salt Lake, 1 Democrat from Salt Lake, 1 independent from Salt Lake, because the parties get to choose who they send to Congress. So in this example, you have one person that runs at the geographic level, and then the party gets to select the remaining candidates. So we have 4 people that we vote directly on, and then we have 4 other candidates that the parties get to choose based off of voter turnout. In this one, we don't vote for anybody specifically, we really vote for party. So we would say, I want more Republican representation, or I want more Democratic representation, or I want more third-party representation. And then the party goes ahead and says, all right, this is who we're going to send to Washington, D.C. to represent Utah Republican interests, or to represent Utah Democratic interests. So this allows for geographic representation and an unfair awarding of power, but tends to be more stable. This increases the size of Congress, so you almost double the size of the legislative body, allows for geographic representation and a more proportional power sharing. This gets rid of geographic representation, but provides for more equitable power sharing. Those are the 3 different kinds of basic ideas that we have. This is winner take all, our current system. This is a mixed member proportional system, and this is just a generic kind of proportional representation. So Harley, any questions before we turn to the chat questions?
No.
Okay. So let's see here. We trade fairness for stability in a sense. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. And just like Peter was saying, I think it gets more chaotic. The more fair we make it, the more chaotic it is. And so yeah, I feel like that's a correct way to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Israel on Tuesday. Israel, Italy is actually another really good example. These are great case studies in the fact that when you have proportional systems and a population that is fractured among multiple different political parties, it gets really, really hard to create a cohesive, consistent governing body, because there's just so many separate interests that are getting associated. Proportional representation also has one other potential drawback, though, which I should mention before we finish answering the chat questions. We've talked a little bit about America's, so this is our political spectrum, right? So here's our far left, here's our far right. But on a global perspective, we're kind of already in the middle of this somewhat. Part of that is because we have a 2-party winner-take-all system. Because in order for a Democrat, especially at the presidential level, to win presidential elections, they at least have to convince some moderate voters to vote for them. Same thing with Republicans. When you look at a proportional system, though, oftentimes what you'll have is, let's say we've got 5 parties, okay? We've got the Republicans, we've got the sort of Republicans, we've got the Democrats, we've got the sort of Democrats, and then we've got our tinfoil hat party, right? Tinfoil hat. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to have an election. And the Republicans win about 30% of the population. The sort of Republicans win about 10% of the population. The Democrats win about 30%. The sort of Democrats win about 10%. So this gives us what so far? 80%, right? You know what? We're going to be even more generous to these parties. We're going to give them 15%. That leaves our tinfoil hat party with 10% of the vote, because these are the 5 major political parties. Now, in a winner-take-all situation, if the Republican was running in a specific state, they would win all of the votes in that state. If a Democrat was winning, they would win all the votes in that state. But because we've decided to have a multi-party system with proportional representation, if we look at these 2 groups combined, they both equal what percentage of the total population?
90.
Well, so 90 combined, but 45 together as an ideological spectrum, right? So Democrats and sort of Democrats are about 45, Republicans and sort of Republicans are about 45, and then we have our tinfoil hat party down here. If I'm a Republican and I get the first chance to make a government, because that's how parliamentary systems work, my first partner is going to be my sort of Republicans. Who's my second and third partner going to be?
Democrats?
No!
What?
Why? Because they're on the opposite ideological perspective, right?
Yeah.
Because if I were to go ahead and draw this, I'm here as a Republican. The Dems are all the way over here. And the sort of Dems, they might be right here. What about this party, though? The tinfoil hat party says, I will join your government, and all you have to do is mandate that people wear tinfoil hats when they leave the house. That's the only policy prescription they want to see happen. They'll say, I'll vote with you on everything else. You just let me make sure that people have to wear tinfoil hats when they leave the house. Do you know what happens in this situation? This is who we form with, and now all of a sudden, everybody's wearing tinfoil hats whenever they leave the house. In Israel, this translates into basically or Israeli settlements on Palestinian land. So you have these ultra-right Israeli political parties, they're the Orthodox parties, and they say the only thing we care about is that we get to continue to build settlements. And so the Israeli government says, well, we're generally more conservative. We're not going to work with our liberal counterparts. Instead, we're going to make a deal with these fringe parties, and we'll give them what they want as long as they support our government. And so instead of having a moderate government that represents 90% of the people, you have a conservative or a liberal government that represents 45% of the population and has to make some crazy policy prescriptions in order to continue to stay in power.
Yeah, okay.
Yep, that's because humans are stupid, and that's how we do things. So this is a serious potential concern with proportional systems. All right, so let's go ahead and try and answer some more of these questions. I do see that Jeremy has popped in here quite a bit. So how would you handle representatives in the Senate in options B and C? That's a really good question. I'll take this one, Harley.
Okay.
So you can do a couple of things. One, you can leave the Senate alone, and you can say, senators continue to run on off years, and whoever wins the most votes wins the Senate position. Or you could double the size of the Senate, and you could make all 4 senators run at the same time, and then proportionally allot them. So it kind of depends on what you want to do. The Senate is supposed to be a more dignified, deliberative legislative body than the House of Representatives. And so a lot of it kind of boils down to, do we want to maintain American traditions and American governance, or do we want to completely transition the system over into something that looks like another government, which is, this parliamentary process? You potentially dissolve the Senate, like was mentioned, and just have a single legislative body that makes all of the laws, and there's no two or bicameral legislative body where you have one and then a kind of a higher deliberative body. So, there's a lot of different potential options there. Which one is the most effective kind of determines on what sort of outcome you're looking for. So the Senate acts as a check on some of our worst populist impulses. At least that's the idea. It makes decisions slower than the House does, but hopefully it also makes decisions that are more thoughtful and reasoned. And typically, historically, senators have gotten along a lot better than representatives have gotten along, because they serve together for longer periods of time, they're in office longer, they have less time focused on campaigning and more time focused on actual making policy decisions, because they're in for 6 years instead of for 2. All right. Okay, so Jeremy has jumped in there as well to post some stuff. That was basically proportional representation in a super quick period of time. We talked about how it might apply to Electoral College, and we talked about how it might apply to the legislative system. Harley, any questions or thoughts before we wrap up today's?
Yeah, so there's just a thought that I had as we were going through the options with what's option B called again?
Mixed member?
Member, yeah. So I thought, as I've been thinking about that, how equal that is and how much that really would represent a population, to double the amount of people in the House of Representatives. We also have to think about what that would entail too, where now there's almost 1,000 people in the House of Representatives that have to come together and make decisions. And sometimes those decisions they have to make need to be quick and they're pressing issues. And so I think that's just another thought that I had is we would be more well represented in an equal way and in a way that's true to what the states are, but there would just be so many people. It's kind of, you just have to weigh the consequences of that as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a good observation. So one thing I don't want people to think is that there's a perfect system.
Yeah.
So proportional representation is not perfect. It's more fair, It's more representative of what voters actually want, but it has challenges associated with it. And the current system that we have is certainly not fair when you look at a proportional system, but it also works in more efficient ways perhaps than proportional systems do. And so the big question, and this is something we've talked about in the class before, is there's not really a right and a wrong answer to a lot of these questions. There are answers that we feel most closely match what we would like to see happen, but there's no decision that you can make about governance that doesn't result in some sort of ripple effect or have some sort of negative consequence. It's not possible. We're dealing with imperfect people and imperfect institutions trying to do the best they can in complicated situations. All right, so we've got one question left, and then we'll wrap it up for today. So, are there other countries that use proportional representation that have historically been stable, even though these possibilities for unstable processes exist? It's a really good question. Yes and no, sort of ish. And let me explain why this is, okay? So, when we look at other states that use proportional representation, democracy is not super old in the modern era. So the United States is the first country really to adopt democratic institutions in the modern era, and we waved the flag for everybody else. After us kind of came France, and France burned that sucker down pretty quick, right? So France decided, vive la revolution, and then they beheaded everybody, and then they got an emperor again, and then a couple more kings, and they're like, well, let's try this whole republic thing again. I think they're on their 5th republic at this point. So it depends on how long you want a country to be stable. And maybe stability is not all it's cracked up to be. So, I mean, dictatorships are super stable for 40 years, right?
Yeah.
Are we okay with stability as a price for repression or unequal representation? Those are difficult questions to kind of deal with. Two-party systems that have a winner-take-all approach are more stable. They last longer. The United States is the oldest continuous democracy in modern history. Okay, we've been around at this more than longer than anybody else, and we break stuff and we try and fix it, and we kind of muddle through. We're not the poster child though for other democracies. When they set up new countries, they actually looked at Canada's constitution.
Really?
That's the basics for the UN and for other international organizations. It's deemed as more stable and more realistic because we're just kind of quirky Americans in some ways. And so you're going to have instability when you have proportional systems. The question is that okay? And can we mitigate that instability to the point where we feel like we're still getting effective governance out of our country? So those are things you guys should think about. All right, we're wrapping this one up. A couple of notes for everybody. If you're watching this live, I'm going to go ahead and post a Canvas quiz in a few minutes where you guys can ask any question in the next 24 hours, and then I will respond to it tomorrow afternoon so that we can go ahead and get you guys ready for the paper that's due on Tuesday. If you're watching this as a recorded session, I'll put that note in the Canvas survey as well. The questions will be anonymous, but please go ahead and respond to that. If you're not in my class, well, thanks for watching and wasting like 45 minutes of your life. You guys enjoy your coronavirus quarantine, and we'll catch you guys all next week.